Good morning, Colony's family. As you know, today is Mother's Day. And every year on this day, I share a brief reading acknowledging both the pain and the joy of today. Today, I share these words in a different setting, but they are still true. To those who gave birth this year to their first child, we celebrate with you. To those who lost a child this year, we mourn with you. To those who are in the trenches with little ones every day and wear the badge of food stains, we appreciate you. To those who experienced loss through miscarriage, failed adoptions, or running away, we mourn with you. To those who walk the hard path of infertility, fraught with pokes and prods, tears and disappointment, we walk with you. Forgive us when we say foolish things. We don't mean to make it harder than it is. To those who are foster moms, mentor moms, and spiritual moms, we need you. To those who have warm and close relationships with your children, we celebrate with you. And to those who have disappointment, heartache, and distance with your children, we sit with you. To those who lost their mothers this year, we grieve with you. To those who experienced abuse at the hands of your own mother, we acknowledge your experience. To those who lived through driving tests, medical tests, and the overall testing of motherhood, we are better for having you in our midst. To those who are single and long to be married and mothering your own children, we mourn that life has not turned out the way you longed for it to be. And to those who step-parent, we walk with you on these complex paths. To those who envisioned lavishing love on grandchildren, yet that dream is not to be, we grieve with you. To those who will have emptier nests in the upcoming year, we grieve and rejoice with you. To those who placed children up for adoption, we commend you for your selflessness and remember how you hold that child in your heart. And to those who are pregnant with new life, both expected and surprising, we anticipate with you. This Mother's Day, we walk with you. Mothering is not for the faint of heart. We have real warriors in our midst. Today, our study brings us to the feet of two of these warriors from the Old Testament book of Ruth. In the Jewish scriptures, Ruth follows Proverbs 31, the description of the virtuous woman, as if to suggest that this story is that chapter embodied. The book is also read around this time of year during the harvest, a celebration known as the Festival of Weeks or the Pentecost. But the story of Ruth does not begin with harvest or celebration. A famine has forced Elimelech, his wife Naomi, and two sons to move away from Bethlehem for their own survival. And it's noteworthy in the story that Bethlehem means house of bread. But there is no bread, and their journey brings them to Moab. While there, wave after wave of tragedy pummels Naomi. First, her husband dies. Without extended family, Naomi becomes dependent on her two sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. And after they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died. And Naomi was left without her two sons and her husband. Mahlon and Chilion were married for 10 years. That is, if you do the math, 240 disappointments for Naomi as she waits to become a grandmother. And now, still dealing with the grief of the loss of her own husband, Naomi buries her 2 sons. She watches as her daughters-in-law become widows. About this time, Naomi hears rumors of fortunes turning in her homeland. So she packs up and sets out towards Bethlehem. On the road, the text doesn't provide any information about how far into the journey. Naomi sends her daughters-in-law back to their father's house in Moab. She says to them, "Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home. I'm too old to have another husband. No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." The Hebrew term for widow is almanah. It's connected to the word for unable to speak. Widows in that culture, not unlike this one, were voiceless. Oprah and Ruth are young enough to have other options in their own country. But for Naomi, the only hope that she has is for her suffering to come to an end. And we hear her wrestling with questions like, has my usefulness expired? And is God good for me? Or is God good for women? Her life has stalled. Someone has pushed the pause button. You may know how the story ends. You may know that she becomes the great-grandmother of David, the king of Israel. But don't rush there just yet. My friend Mike Cope recently shared remembering an ad in the Christian Chronicle from years ago announcing the release of a new CD from Harding's a cappella choir. The name of the recording was "Teach Me, Lord, to Wait." And the ad had a checkbox where you could check, "Rush my order" of the CD. Don't rush to the end of the story, because Naomi cannot. She is the Bible's version of Job, someone who has lost everything and begins to question God. And like in Job, God does not provide any explanation. For now, the 3 women embrace and weep. The text tells us that Ruth clung to her, saying, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if death separates you and me." These words have been read at weddings for decades, symbolizing a bride's commitment to her husband. And just once, I would like for these words to be used in context as the young bride turns away from her groom to her mother-in-law to announce, "Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay." See, these are not words of romance, but of conversion. Naomi has laid out all of the evidence against God's goodness. And Ruth makes a decision to follow Yahweh. This is the hinge moment of the story as an almanah, a voiceless woman, embraces her purpose as an image bearer of the Almighty God. Naomi reluctantly allows Ruth to join her back in Bethlehem. The poverty that these 2 women have still presents a problem. And Ruth risks working in the fields to provide. And I say risk because this is in the days of when the judges ruled. Moral decay was on display in the time of the judges. The last couple of chapters tell of the vulnerability of women, particularly foreign women, that they could face during this time. It just so happened that Ruth was in the field of a man of standing, who also just so happened to be a relative. Old Testament law required farmers to leave the outside edges of a field for the poor. But the farmer was left to wrestle with the tension of how much is the outer edges. And some may have been a little stingy, but Boaz, this man of standing, does much more than leave the outer edges. He protects the voiceless and the vulnerable. He allows Ruth to eat lunch with his hired hands and sends her back with some 30 pounds of grain. When Naomi sees the haul that she has come back with, she is awakened to God's presence. She says, "The Lord bless him." He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. He is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers. Naomi's eyes have been opened to the goodness of God. She once denied he was good, and now she sees he is. I once heard the story of a Bible translator who was stumped on how to translate the word for lamb for a people who had never seen a lamb. Finally, he decided to settle on the word llama. Only llama, while it makes sense on some level, a llama isn't anything like the silent and defenseless little lamb, and it misses the point completely. See, translators face a similar dilemma when they come across the Hebrew word that Naomi uses for kindness. It's the Hebrew word hesed. And no word captures the exact meaning. Consequently, we end up with a mix of words like kindness and mercy, loyalty, or loving kindness. Carolyn Justice James writes that hesed is a strong Hebrew word that sums up the ideal love for a neighbor. It's the ideal way that human beings are to live together from the beginning. It's actually the kind of love we find most fully lived out in Jesus. In a nutshell, hesed is the gospel lived out. In this short book where God is barely mentioned, we see that the deliverance of God often comes through the people of God, the people who are bearing his image. We long to see the waters parted, or to be led by a fiery cloud, or to see a man walk on water, or to see him raise someone from the dead. Disappointment hits when life is filled with ordinary moments. In 1987, a 9-year-old John O'Leary suffered third-degree burns on 87% of his body during a tragic accident with fire and gasoline. Injured on Saturday, on Sunday, Jack Buck, the voice of the St. Louis Cardinals, entered the room and said, "Kid, wake up. You are going to live. You are going to survive. Keep fighting." Buck left that day and returned every day until the young boy could go home. O'Leary spent 5 months in the hospital, endured dozens of surgeries, lost all of his fingers due to amputation. He had to relearn how to walk, write, and feed himself. Before O'Leary learned to write, Buck sent an autographed baseball by Ozzie Smith, the shortstop of the St. Louis Cardinals, and left a note that said he had to, in order to get another baseball card, he had to write a thank you note to Ozzie Smith. Immediately, O'Leary went and began to struggle to scribble out a thank you note. And after he did, he received another baseball. Buck ended up sending 60 baseballs that year, leading O'Leary to say, "It changed my world. It changed me from the inside out." O'Leary's story is remarkable not because of the circumstances or the names attached, but because the difference made in a life by showing up day in and day out. This is the gospel of Ruth, a beacon of light spreading across a dark landscape. Perhaps unknowingly, Ruth and Boaz, they act as people who are expanding the kingdom of God. They are engaging in kingdom work. And the kingdom advances through these daily acts of hesed, of cooking food for your family, running your business in such a way that it cares for the disadvantaged, and staying up sleepless nights, caring for a sick child. See, often God answers our prayers through the simple embrace of another. While we are stuck at home, we are overwhelmed with pointing fingers and arguments. It's easy to be lulled into correcting the world's opinions with these pithy memes or long Facebook diatribes. But your purpose is found in sharing the everlasting love of God, even while you wait. If you haven't already taken communion, now is the great time to do that. It is a time to gather around the table and share in God's love. And as you do that, let me challenge you to share God's love to the world.